There's a kind of silence that sits heavy in a man's chest, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet road or even a grave. No, I'm talking about the silence a man carries himself, the kind he's been hauling around so long he stopped noticing the weight. I'd ridden through 100 towns by then, past 100 windows, heard 100 sounds drift out from behind closed doors, laughter, arguing, a baby crying, someone singing off-key. I never stopped, not once, because stopping means you want something, and wanting something means you might lose it, and I had made a quiet, private peace with losing things a long time ago. But then there was that kitchen. That particular kitchen on that particular afternoon, with the smell of something warm drifting out through a cracked window, and a voice, low and steady, talking to no one. Or maybe to God, or maybe to herself, I don't know. I know I pulled the reins without deciding to. I know my horse stopped like she already understood. And I know that whatever happened after that, whatever I'm about to tell you, I have never once called it an accident. This is the story of a woman who wasn't trying to save anyone, and a man who didn't know he needed saving, and the strange, unhurried miracle of what grows when two broken people stop pretending they aren't. Listen close, this one matters. My name is Caleb Duran, and I keep a ledger. Not for money, I never had enough of that to bother tracking. I keep a ledger for days. I write down what I did, what I saw, what the weather felt like, whether it was a day worth remembering or a day I'd just as soon forget. 43 years old, and I've filled 11 of those little brown books. My mother thought it was strange. My trail boss, back when I had one, used to call me the chronicler like it was an insult. My horse, Rue, a gray mare with opinions about everything, doesn't seem to mind. She never asks why I stop at dusk and scratch my thoughts into paper. She just waits. I mention this because when I rode into the town of Callaway Creek on the 3rd Thursday of September, I wrote exactly 4 words in my ledger that night. Heard a woman singing. Nothing else. Not the name of the town, not the weather, which had been foul and cold, a thin drizzle that soaked through wool like it had a grudge. Not the fact that I'd been 2 days without a real meal. Not the name of the creek I'd forded that morning, or the coyote I'd spooked out of a mesquite thicket around noon. Just those 4 words. Because that was the only thing that happened that day that mattered. Callaway Creek wasn't much. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to argue about passing, a livery stable that smelled like every livery stable I'd ever visited, hay, horse sweat, old wood, and a vague sadness. A general store with a handwritten sign in the window that said credit not extended in letters big enough to read from the saddle. A church with a leaning steeple. A saloon that was doing more business than the church, which is how I knew the town was honest about itself, at least. I had no reason to stay. I had a vague understanding that I was heading toward Colorado, toward a friend of a former trail partner who might have worked for a man who was good with horses and quiet about other people's business. That was the whole of my plan. It had been my whole plan for 11 months, which tells you something about the quality of my plans. I rode past the church, past the saloon, past the general store. And then I rode past a small clapboard house set back from the road, maybe 30 yards from the street, with a kitchen window on the south side facing a scraggly kitchen garden, mostly dead from the frost, a few stubborn herbs still holding on, and through that window came the smell. Bread, real bread. Not the hard tack I'd been living off of, not the day-old biscuits from a trail cook who'd given up caring. Bread, warm and yeasty and dense, the kind that fills a room with a specific kind of tenderness that is almost unbearable if you haven't smelled it in a long time. Rue stopped before I told her to. I sat there in the rain like a fool, and I listened. Because there was singing. Low and unhurried, in a voice that wasn't performing for anyone, the voice of a woman doing a task she'd done 1,000 times, letting her mind go somewhere else, letting sound come out of her the way breath comes out of a sleeping person, without intention, without audience, just sound and memory and the rhythm of hands working dough. I couldn't make out the words at first. Something old. Something that had the shape of a hymn without quite being one. The kind of melody that belongs to a specific place, a specific people, learned not from a hymnal but from a grandmother's kitchen, from a childhood that happened too fast. I sat on Rue in the September drizzle for what was probably a full minute, maybe two. Then the singing stopped. And a voice, same voice, said clearly, not loudly, just plainly, "You planning on sitting out there until you rust?" I will tell you this about myself. I am not a man who startles easy. 43 years, 11 ledgers, I have been shot at, thrown from horses, struck by lightning once at a distance that felt closer than the official record of 100 yards suggested. I do not startle. I startled. Rue made a sound that I can only describe as amused. I started. I apologize, ma'am, I didn't mean to. Come around to the door if you're going to apologize, she said. Can't hear you proper through a window in the rain. And that was the whole of the invitation. I tied Rue to the fence post. She looked at me with an expression that I swear contained the words about time, and I came around to the door. Her name was Nuala Redcloud. She told me this the way you tell someone the time, flatly, matter-of-factly, without preamble. She was standing at the kitchen table with flour on her forearms up to the elbow and a dish towel tucked into the waistband of her apron. She was Apache. Not the first Apache woman I'd encountered in 30 years of riding this country, but the first who'd spoken to me through a window and offered me a doorway in the same breath, and I was already aware that I should pay attention. She was maybe 35. Maybe older. Her face had the quality of someone who'd lived precisely and not wastefully, so the years showed as depth rather than damage. Her eyes were very dark and very direct, and they assessed me without appearing to, the way an experienced person does, taking in the state of my clothes, the quality of my horse, the particular slump of my shoulders that I've been told announces exhaustion before I ever open my mouth. Sit, she said. There's coffee on the stove, don't touch the bread yet. I sat, I put my hat on my knee. I noticed, as I am trained by 11 ledgers to notice, the state of the kitchen. Clean, methodical, everything had a place and everything was in it. A dried bundle of sage hung near the window. A small photograph on a shelf near the door. A man, blurred, taken at some distance, so I couldn't make out his face. A pair of men's boots near the door, very worn, in the corner where you'd put them if you were keeping them out of habit rather than expectation. I didn't ask about the boots. The coffee was stronger than anything I'd tasted in months, and it warmed the cold out of my hands so fast I almost made a sound. Where are you headed? She asked, not looking at me. Back at the bread, her hands working. Colorado, I said, more or less. More or less, she repeated, like she was deciding what to do with that. I have a contact, possible work. With horses. I looked at her, she hadn't looked at me. How'd you know? Your hands, she said. And your horse trusts you, which means you know what you're doing. And you ride like you don't own the road, which means you've spent a long time being careful around large animals. Horse work. I didn't know what to say to that, so I drank my coffee. There's a man in this town needs someone to work his remuda through the winter, she said. Orson Mays, ranch 3 miles north. He lost his wrangler in August and hasn't replaced him, and the horses are suffering for it. That's specific information to offer a stranger. She finally looked at me, direct, not unkind. You've been riding a long time toward a contact who might not pan out. Orson Mays is certain. Colorado is more or less. I meant to stay one night. I stayed 3, at the Callaway Creek Inn, a generous term for a room above the general store with a mattress that crackled like a campfire. And every morning I found some reason not to ride north to Orson Mays yet, and every afternoon I found myself walking past the small clapboard house with the cracked south window. On the second afternoon, she was in the kitchen garden. Cutting the last of something, lavender, I thought, or maybe rosemary. I know horses better than herbs. She had her hair tied back with a piece of cloth, and she was working with the same efficiency she applied to everything, snipping and sorting without wasted motion. "You're still here," she said without looking up. "Leaving tomorrow," I said. "You said that yesterday." I had nothing to say to that. She straightened up, brushed her hands on her apron, and looked at me with that direct, assessing look. "Do you want to come in? I'm teaching today." "Teaching?" "3 children, Tuesday afternoons." She paused. "Their mother died in February. Their father is," she considered her words, "he is having difficulty. I teach them reading, some numbers, sometimes cooking. Mostly I give them somewhere to be that isn't their house." I stood there. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "You can sit with your coffee and your ledger and your very complicated expression. They won't bother you." I hadn't mentioned the ledger. I looked at my coat pocket. "You've been writing in it every time I see you pass," she said simply. I went inside. I sat with my coffee and my ledger. 3 children arrived, 2 girls and a boy. The oldest maybe 11, the youngest 6, all 3 wearing the careful, watchful expressions of children who have learned to be quiet in new spaces because quiet is safer. I didn't write anything in the ledger that afternoon. I listened to her teach. She taught the way she sang, without performance. She explained things once clearly, and then she let the children figure it out, and she stayed close enough that they knew they weren't alone in the figuring. When the youngest girl struggled with a letter, Nuala didn't correct her loudly. She sat beside her, very close, and traced the letter with her own finger first and said, "Again," and waited. And when the girl got it right, Nuala said, "There it is," in a voice so quiet and certain that the girl looked up like something inside her had just settled. I wrote that down later, "There it is," the way she said it. After the children left, I helped her stack the reading primers I offered. She didn't ask. And in the standing together in the kitchen, I said something I hadn't planned to say. "I lost someone too." She was quiet. 3 years ago. My wife, fever. It was fast, which they tell me is a mercy, but I've never entirely. I stopped. I looked at my hat, which I was holding. I do that when I'm uncomfortable. I hold my hat and look at it like it owes me something. I've been writing since, more or less. The kitchen was very still. "I know," she said. "How?" "The way you looked at the boots by the door when you came in the first time," she said. "You recognized them, not the boots, the place of them, where they were." I thought about that for a long time after I left. I thought about the boots in the corner, the way she'd kept them, not as a shrine, not displayed, just in the corner where boots go, like she was keeping her life livable by keeping everything in the place it belonged, even the things that no longer had a person attached to them. That night in the crackling mattress room above the general store, I opened my ledger. I wrote more than 4 words. On the 4th morning, I rode north to Orson Mays. Not because I decided to stay in Callaway Creek. I told myself that very firmly, several times, while Rue carried me up the frostbitten road with her usual air of knowing better. I rode to Mays Ranch because the alternative was riding toward Colorado and the more or less, and I had a practical obligation to good sense, and good sense said work was work, and work was something I understood. The ranch was called the Double Drum, named. Orson Mays explained when he shook my hand, after the 2 box canyons on its east boundary that made a sound like drumming when the wind came through right. He was a big man, early 60s, red-faced from a life outdoors, with the permanently squinting expression of someone who'd spent 40 years looking into sun and wind and hadn't found what they were looking for yet. He showed me the remuda, 11 horses in various states of neglect, not cruel neglect, the neglect of understaffing and grief. His wrangler, the man who'd left in August, had been with him for 7 years. Left for California, Mays said. Can't blame a man for California. He said this the way people say things they've practiced saying to cover what they actually felt. The horses were manageable. 2 were showing the early signs of hoof rot. One was a young gelding with trust issues and a wild eye that had probably been pushed too hard too fast by someone impatient. I spent the first morning walking the fence line of their pasture without approaching any of them, just being present, letting them get used to me before I asked them for anything. Mays watched from the fence. After an hour he said, "You want to actually work them?" "Not yet," I said. He squinted at me, then he went back inside. I took the wrangler's bunk in the small outbuilding behind the main house. It had a window facing south, and on clear mornings from the right angle I could see the distant outline of Cowboy Creek's church steeple. I don't know why I noticed this. I noticed it. I wrote it in the ledger, "Can see the church steeple from here. Weather clear. Hoof rot on the bay and the roan." The gelding's name, apparently, is Consequence, which the previous wrangler named him and which I understand completely. Mays paid me fair. Room, board, a weekly rate that wasn't generous but wasn't insulting. I worked 6 days. I ate supper at the main house with Mays and his daughter Priscilla, who was 19 and studying to be a schoolteacher, and had the particular quality of intelligence that makes a room feel sharper when you walk into it. She asked me questions at supper, about the territories I'd ridden through, about the wars I'd been near if not in, about my ledgers, in a way that was curious rather than intrusive. "Miss Redcloud teaches Amos Wheeler's children," she said one evening, when the conversation had drifted toward Cowboy Creek. "She's been wonderful with them." The youngest one had stopped talking for a while after the mother died. "She's talking again now." "The youngest girl," I said. Priscilla looked at me. "You've met her." I explained about the Tuesday afternoons. Priscilla's expression did something complicated that I didn't try to interpret. "Nuala Redcloud is the most remarkable person in this county," Priscilla said, in the tone of someone stating a fact that they expect to be disputed. I didn't dispute it. Mays across the table said nothing. He looked at his plate. On my 7th Sunday at the Double Drum, I rode into Cowboy Creek. I told myself it was for supplies. This was partially true. I needed saddle soap and a new length of rope. I bought these things. I also walked, with no particular intentionality, in the direction of the small clapboard house. She was on the porch, sitting with a book open in her lap. Though she wasn't reading, she was watching the road, or watching the sky, or watching something that wasn't there. She was wearing a blanket around her shoulders against the October cold, and her hair was loose, which was the first time I'd seen it that way, and it changed her face slightly, made her look less defended somehow, though I wouldn't have said she was defended before. She saw me coming from a long way off. "You stayed," she said. "Working for Mays," I said. "Temporary." She considered this. "Come in, there's soup." I thought about saying I'd already eaten. I hadn't. And even if I had, I think I would have come in anyway, and I think she knew that, and I think neither of us said anything about it. The soup was a venison thing, dark and heavy with herbs I didn't recognize, served with a bread that was denser than the first one I'd smelled through the window. "Different recipe," she said when I mentioned it, her mouth almost doing something that might have been a smile. "That first one was for the Wheeler children. They like it sweeter." We ate at the kitchen table. I was learning the geography of that kitchen, the shelf with the photograph, the boots in the corner, the sage bundle by the window. I was learning what was permanent and what was seasonal, the dried peppers that had appeared last week, the stack of children's slates near the far wall. "Can I ask about the photograph?" I said. A pause, not a recoil, a pause. "My husband," she said. "Samuel, he died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." "He was a good man." She said this carefully, the way you say something that's true and also not the whole of what's true. "He worked for the territorial government for a time, as a translator. He was very good at it. He understood both sides of what was being said, not just the words." Another pause. He was killed in a misunderstanding. That's what they called it, a misunderstanding. I looked at my bowl. I stayed, she said. Some people thought I should go back to my family's territory, but I had built something here, the school, the garden, the children who needed somewhere to be. She picked up her spoon. I don't think grief should determine your geography. I thought about 11 months of riding toward Colorado, more or less. I think it might have determined mine, I said. She looked at me then, that direct look, the one that doesn't accuse but doesn't let you off the hook either. I think you knew that already, she said, before you said it just now. She was right. I had known it. It was one of the things that had been sitting in my chest with the weight of unsaid things, the things I wrote around in the ledger instead of writing directly, because writing them directly would make them too solid to keep carrying the way I was carrying them. My wife's name was Clara, I said. Tell me about her. No one had asked me that. In 11 months of writing, not a single person had asked me that. They'd said sorry for your loss and how long ago, and they'd nodded in the particular way that signals the end of a topic. No one had said tell me about her like it was the natural next thing to say. Like the story of Clara was something worth making room for. I talked for a long time. She listened the way she taught, fully present, not interrupting, close enough that you knew you weren't alone in the telling. I should tell you about the trouble, because there was trouble, and I'd be dishonest to leave it out. His name was Dale Forsyth. He ran a small cattle operation east of town, and he had opinions, the kind of loud, confident opinions that tend to fill rooms before the person holding them has fully arrived. I'd encountered him twice in the general store. He spoke to Nuala Red Cloud when their paths crossed, with a specific quality of civility that was worse than rudeness. The civility of someone performing tolerance rather than feeling it, the kind where you can hear the effort. On a Wednesday in late October, I was at the general store when Forsyth came in with two of his hands. He saw Nuala at the counter. She was collecting a postal parcel, and he said something I won't repeat in full, but the shape of it was a comment about Apache women making themselves at home in decent establishments, and the color of it was mean in the particular way of a man who has decided that someone's presence is an affront, and that his discomfort grants him authority. Nuala didn't respond. She took her parcel, thanked the store clerk, and turned to leave. I was between her and the door. I didn't move. I looked at Forsyth. He was big. Not as big as he thought he was, they never are, but big. And his two hands were looking at him the way men look at someone they've agreed to follow regardless of where he goes. "You're in the way," Forsyth said to me. "I know," I said. A long moment. Then Forsyth made a sound that was either a laugh or a dismissal. It was trying to be both, and turned to make his purchase. His hands lost interest in me, which is often how it goes. If the man they're following loses the thread, they lose it too. Outside, Nuala stopped on the boardwalk. She was holding her parcel against her chest with both arms, and her jaw was set in a way that I was starting to recognize. The look of someone absorbing something they've absorbed many times, and have developed a kind of terrible efficiency at absorbing. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said again. "It doesn't help," she said it without cruelty. "It'll make him more deliberate about it." "Probably." She looked at me. "You'd do it again." "Yeah." Something shifted in her face. The jaw unlocked slightly. Something behind the eyes changed in a way I couldn't fully read, only note. She adjusted the parcel in her arms. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. "Properly, not soup you can refuse to call a visit." I looked at my hat. I was holding it. "Okay," I said. That Sunday was the first time she showed me the space behind the house. A small kitchen garden, larger than the front one I'd seen from the road, with a winterized raised bed she'd built herself in an adobe well housing, and at the far corner, a low stone structure that turned out to be a sweat lodge, disused but maintained. Samuel built it, she said, standing at the corner of the garden. His people, his mother's people, had one when he was young. He wanted to keep the practice. She paused. I kept the structure. I've kept many things that I can't fully use because some things you keep for what they mean rather than what they do. I stood beside her. The afternoon light was low and orange and very clean. The way October light is in that country, like the air had been clarified somehow, like seeing through water. I've been keeping my horse for 3 years, I said. Rue. My wife named her. I bought her 6 months before Clara died. She never got to ride her much. But she named her and she fed her, and Rue sort of knows, I think, or I need her to know. Either way, I stopped. I keep her for what she means. Nuala was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, that's it exactly. We stood there in the orange October light. I think that was the moment. I'm not sure what moment means exactly, not something that announces itself, not something with a beginning and an end you can point to in a ledger. Just a shift. The way a room changes when you open a window, not because anything entered or left, but because the pressure equalized. Something that had been pushing from one side finally found an equal weight. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We went inside and she made coffee, and we talked until the dark came. November came to Callaway Creek, like a man who decided he was no longer in any hurry. The creek itself iced at the edges and ran dark and slow between the frozen margins. The double drum's horses grew their winter coats and became rounder and more philosophical in the way horses do when the cold is honest, and they've adjusted to it. Consequence, the troubled gelding had, over the weeks, developed a habit of following me along the fence line in the mornings. Not close enough to touch, just following, which is how horses show you they've decided to believe in you, tentatively and without commitment, reserving the right to change their minds. I noted this in the ledger. I noted a lot of things. Consequence followed again this morning. 7 feet. Consistent distance. He has decided on 7 feet as the safe perimeter. I respect that. I've had a perimeter myself. I rode into town on Sundays. Always Sundays now. It had settled into a pattern without being declared, the way certain things settle. I had supper at the small clapboard house and stayed until it was impolite to stay later, and then I rode back up the dark road to the double drum, with Rue moving at a pace that suggested she saw no reason to hurry. I'm going to be honest with you about the difficulty of that period, because this is a story about a real thing, not a story about a thing that felt easy. There was a woman in this county, a widow named Forsyth, Dale Forsyth's sister-in-law, his dead brother's wife, who was well-liked and well-regarded, and who had, apparently some time ago, indicated to several mutual acquaintances that she would not be disinterested in a man of steady character and employment. I didn't know any of this until Priscilla Mays mentioned it at supper one November evening in the careful, elaborately casual way that young, intelligent people mention things they want you to notice. Mays, across the table, cleared his throat and became interested in his beef. I mention it, Priscilla said, because you seem settled here, which is good. Which is a good thing, Caleb. She used my name rarely and deliberately. And people notice that you're settled, and people talk about what a settled man might need. Priscilla, Mays said. She's just informing you of the social landscape, Mays said, in a tone that somehow managed to be both a defense of his daughter and a warning to me about the nature of small towns. I thanked Priscilla. I said I'd think about it. I said nothing else. That night in the bunk, I lay awake and listened to the wind come through the box canyons, that sound like drumming, far away, and I thought about what it means to be a settled man, what it means to be seen as one, what it means when the community around you has started to plan on your behalf, inserting you into a future that looks sensible and uncomplicated, and like it was built with conventional materials. I thought about the boots in the corner, and the photograph, and the woman who'd kept both. And I thought, the sensible thing and the true thing are not always the same thing, and I am 43 years old and I have ridden 11 months toward a more or less, and I think I am done with sensible for the sake of convenient. I want to tell you about a Sunday in mid-November, because it was the Sunday that changed the shape of things. I arrived at the house to find 3 horses tied at the fence. None of them were horses I recognized. The front door was open, and there were voices inside, women's voices, 2 of them and Nula's. And from the sounds of it, the conversation had a quality that suggested it had been going on for some time and had developed an edge. I stood on the road for a moment, then I walked up to the door. The women inside were from the town's church auxiliary. I recognized one of them, Mrs. Aldian, who ran the post office 3 mornings a week, and had a talent for being correct about things in a way that made people feel slightly worse about themselves. The other was younger, someone I hadn't placed yet. They were sitting at Nula's kitchen table, and Nula was standing at the stove with her back to them, and I could see, from the angle of her shoulders, the quality of her stillness. That absorbing efficiency I'd seen in the general store, except this was her kitchen, her table, and the efficiency required more effort here. I heard the last few words before the silence noticed me in the doorway. Only saying that people have noticed. It's not no one means any harm by it, but it does attract a certain kind of comment, and for his sake as much as anything. They saw me. A silence of a very specific kind fell over the kitchen. Nula turned, she looked at me. Her face was perfectly composed, which I understood by then to mean she was working very hard at something, and the work was not visible because she had made the choice long ago not to let it be visible. "Caleb," she said, "these are Mrs. Aldian and Miss Pryor. They were just leaving." They were just leaving. The way she said it, not rude, not raised, just certain, was the most authoritative sentence I had heard in a long time. They gathered themselves with the particular efficiency of women who had been asked to leave before they were ready and had no good counterargument and knew it. They left. Nula shut the door. She stayed with her back to me for a moment, facing the door. Then she turned around, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she put her hands flat on the surface, and she looked at them. "They came to tell me," she said, "that my association with you is creating difficulty for you and the community." "For me," I said. "That's what they said. They didn't mention difficulty for you." A small silence. "No," she said, "they did not." I pulled out the chair across from her and I sat down. I looked at her hands on the table. I looked at my own, which I placed beside hers, not touching, just there. "Nula." She looked up. "I'm going to say something directly," I said, "and I want you to let me finish it before you say anything practical at me." A very small movement at the corner of her mouth. "I have been riding for 3 years with my grief packed up like camp equipment, because I thought at some point I'd set up camp somewhere and unpack it, and somewhere kept turning into somewhere else. I ended up here because you spoke through a window on a cold afternoon, and I have not wanted to leave since that day. And I understand what the complications are. I understand what people will say. I understand that you've built something here that matters, and that you've been protecting it with considerable effort, and I know that I am not that this is not simple." She was watching me. "But I'd like to stop making the sensible choice," I said, if that's something you'd consider." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside I could hear the wind starting up, coming down from the north. The first real winter wind, the one that means business. Nula looked at her hands on the table, then she looked at mine. "You held your hat just now," she said, "and then you put it on the table. You've never done that before." "I know." "What does that mean?" "I think it means I ran out of things to look at it for," I said. She was quiet for a long moment. "I tried simple once," she said. "With Samuel, they told us it would be complicated. They were right. It was complicated and it was worth it, and when he died I thought—" She stopped. She started again, slowly. "I thought that maybe I had used up my willingness to do things that were hard, that the budget was gone." She looked at me. "But that's not how it works, I think. I think the budget replenishes. I think that's one of the worst things about being alive." I waited. "Yes," she said. "The simplest word, the hardest one." I'm going to skip over the weeks that followed, not because they weren't important. They were. They were the weeks I will likely think about longest when I'm old and the ledger pages have all turned. But because some things don't need to be documented to be real. Some things are more real for being undocumented. I kept writing in the ledger, but those weeks, I kept certain things back from it, gave them some privacy. What I will tell you is this. Forsyth made his promise difficulty. Not violently, he was too careful for that, or too cowardly, and the line between those two can be very thin. He made it in the way men like him usually make it. Socially, incrementally, through implications and loaded questions, and a specific way of being surprised to see you in certain company that communicates a judgment without ever being a formal accusation. Mays, to his credit, told Forsyth plainly at a town meeting that he found the man's opinions on other people's associations to be a significant waste of everyone's time, Dale, and I'd appreciate it if you'd find something productive to direct them at. Mays reported this to me with the kind of satisfaction that Mays rarely showed about anything, and then he poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and we drank them without making a toast, which is how men sometimes celebrate things they're too private to explain. Mrs. Aldian came back, alone this time without Miss Pryor, and sat in Nuala's kitchen and was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I was speaking out of turn the other week. I'm sorry for it." And that was that. I don't know what shifted in her, and I didn't ask. People can surprise you if you give them the space to find their way back to the better version of themselves. The Wheeler children continued to come on Tuesday afternoons. The youngest one, whose name was Me, had started bringing her rag doll to the lessons. On one particular Tuesday in December, Me left the doll on the kitchen table when her brother came to collect her, and Nuala set it aside carefully, on the shelf near the photograph, near the sage, and said only, "She'll remember where she left it." I wrote that down. In January, I sent a letter to the contact in Colorado. The letter said, "Thank you for the introduction. I have found work here and don't believe I'll be heading on. I wish you good winter and good horses. Caleb Duran." I held the letter before I sealed it. A moment where I tested the decision, the way you test ice before you walk on it, pressing with your weight, feeling for the flex. It held. I should tell you how it ended, or how it didn't end, because stories like this one, the real kind, the kind that don't announce themselves when they're happening, don't have endings so much as they have places where you look up and notice how far you've come from where you were. It was a Sunday in late February. One of those fall spring days that happen once or twice before the real thing, where the light changes angle and the ground smells like itself again, just briefly, before the cold comes back for one last argument. We were in the kitchen garden, the winter bed uncovered now, looking at what had survived, what was coming back, what needed replanting in the spaces where things hadn't made it through. Nuala crouched over the raised bed, turning soil with her hands. She had earth under her fingernails, and her hair was loose in the not quite warm February air. Rue was tied to the fence. She had developed a habit by that point of nosing toward the kitchen window when we were inside, drawn, I believed, by the smell of bread. She was doing that now, even though we were outside. Old habit. She kept it up anyway. Consequence, Mays had told me last week, had let me touch him. Finally, after 4 months, he had lowered his head and let me put my hand on his neck and stood there without flinching. 7 feet had closed slowly, over time, into 0. Mays had asked me if I wanted to buy him. I hadn't given him an answer yet. "Look," Nuala said. She was pointing at the far corner of the bed. Something green. Not much, a few tentative leaves, barely distinguishable from the dark soil, but green and upright and unmistakably there. "What is it?" I said. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "It takes time to see what something becomes." She looked at me when she said it. I looked at her. The February air moved between us, still cold but not winter cold, something changing in it, some slow decision being made by the season about what it was going to turn into. Me's rag doll was still on the shelf by the photograph. She'd remembered to take it, and then she'd left it again on purpose this time. Nuala had said nothing, just moved it slightly, carefully, so it leaned against the frame. I opened my ledger that evening and I started to write, and I filled 4 pages, which I have never done before. I wrote about the garden and the green leaves and the sound of Rue nosing at the kitchen window from outside. I wrote about the photograph and the boots and the things you keep because of what they mean rather than what they do. And then I stopped. I looked at what I'd written. I didn't write the last thing, the thing at the end, the thing that would have explained what I understood that afternoon in the kitchen garden. I left it off, not because I didn't know it, because it belonged to me in a way that even the ledger didn't have a right to. Some things you don't document. Some things you just